"If I sing well, will you give me a plate of food?" she asked, voice small but steady enough to slice through the chatter in the auditorium. Lights snapped on, hot and unforgiving. The charity talent show had been scheduled as a glossy charity photo op. Celebrities, sponsors, polished smiles. Someone in the front row laughed like it was a joke. A camera swung slower than it should have, hungry for spectacle. A judge, lacquered and sharp, clicked his pen and raised an eyebrow the way people raise eyebrows at things that don't belong in their world. Nina stood under that harsh light, thin, coat clinging to her, hands folded around a battered guitar case. Her hair was braided tight. Her fingers moved like someone who had learned to keep rhythm by tapping on subway poles. When she spoke, she did it plainly, refusing the melodrama that others seemed to enjoy. "My name is Nina," she said. Not as an appeal, but as a little stake in the ground, a declaration you could put in a pocket and lean on later. She was 22 and had lived more corners than apartments. She knew where a warm corner of a diner could be found at 2 in the morning and which soup kitchens served the best broth. She knew hunger like a calendar you glanced at every day, but beneath the streetwise exterior there was a voice, not just the one that carried a tune, but a memory-stacked instrument that had learned phrasing from back porch hymns and harmonies from radio soap operas. People sometimes mistook her quiet for fragility. They were wrong. The host, a glossy man named Carter Lyle, smirked into his mic. "This is going to be fun," he said, drawing the audience's polite amusement. The event's PR planner flashed a smile that managed to be both practiced and predatory. "We make space for everyone," she said loudly enough for cameras. Nina heard the qualifiers: room to laugh, room to patronize. A volunteer handed Nina a paper plate with a single sandwich and a napkin, charity rendered as afterthought. She took it like she had taken worse slights, without making the giver uncomfortable. By making a scene, the sandwich sat in her lap like a small, strange trophy. Someone shouted, half mean, half entertained, "Sing for it, then!" She closed her eyes for a beat and felt the scaffolding of the moment fall into place. The whisper of the crowd, the judge's impatience, the way a camera finds the weakest edges and magnifies them. Nina had been performing since she was a kid, in front of stoops and in subway cars, but never in a room with people who had the power to label her, to brand her inspirational or pitiful, depending on who told the story afterwards. Tonight they wanted a show. They wanted to feel good about looking at someone lower on the ladder. Flash! 2 months earlier, Nina sat on a stoop with a woman named Rosa, who taught neighborhood kids to read between the verses of old gospel records. Rosa had told her once, almost as an aside, "You don't owe anyone a miracle, child. Sing for yourself, and let the rest decide their own conscience." Nina tucked that line away like an extra coin. Flash. 3 days ago, someone in a suit from the event's production team had told the volunteer sotto voce, "Make sure the street performers show gratitude." Useful. Optics. The volunteer had nodded. She was already thinking of who to place under the spotlight so cameras could catch the cute moment. Back under the stage lights, Nina opened her mouth. Not to beg, not to plead. Her first syllable was a shade rough, like rope, but it steadied into a line that smelled of old songs and sudden sunlight. The hall cleared the space instinctively, the kind of silence that feels like attention being held rather than given. A woman in the front row, a stylist with a nameplate that read, "Sponsor," folded her hands, unsure whether to be moved or charmed. The judges' faces were unreadable. One of them, Judge Whitman, made a micro-expression that was essentially boredom. Another, an influencer type with perfect teeth, already held up a phone ready to clip for social. Cameras slid closer. Mid-verse, a man from the sponsor table whispered something into the host's ear. Carter Lyle smiled broader, eyes measuring impact. Nina, however, did something they didn't expect. She changed the song. Not drastically, she didn't shift genre or audition for a different skill. She leaned into a bridge that wasn't in the original arrangement and bent the notes in way that made people lean forward. The words she chose were plain, small, exact images of waiting for food lines, of a mother folding her hands at night, of little triumphs like a warm slice of bread. Her phrasing turned the room inward, made them listen to a place they preferred not to live inside. After the last note, where breath and silence met, there was a delay before applause, not the calculated claps from sponsors, but an uneven human sound. Someone behind the stage hissed, "Don't make this about them." The judge, whose pen had clicked loudly all night, mouthed, "Control the narrative." Nina took her plate, set it down on the edge of the stage, and walked off as casually as she had walked on. To anyone watching, it was either the end of a sweet human moment or the start of a story that could be twisted. For Nina, it was a test to see whether her voice could do more than fill ears. Could it tilt the view of people used to seeing her as a prop? A row of DMs on a spunky local blogger's phone lit up. "You seen that? Black girl sang and asked for food. So raw," it read, framed as awe. Down the block, a man with tented fingers muttered something about stunts. In the producer's van, someone said, "This is trending. We spin it our way." Nina felt the tug of eyes, the instant editorializing. She'd learned early that kindness offered from a height often comes with a narrative attached. The night had given her something intangible. Attention, yes, but attention that could be carved to either expose or shield truth. She walked into a narrow backstage corridor where a volunteer offered her a bottle of water and asked if she was okay. She nodded. If this small, sharp moment has you leaning in, and you want to see how a single song can begin a much bigger story, consider subscribing. It helps tell the rest. Nina knew that this night would not simply pass. Something was already stirring behind the smiles. A camera angle had captured a detail, a folded program tucked under the sponsor's chair with a name that kept showing up in contracts she'd read the month before. She rubbed her thumb over the dent on her guitar case and kept her mouth shut. The real trouble, she suspected, wasn't the lack of a warm meal. It was who benefited from people believing she was merely entertainment. The lights dimmed in the auditorium, but a series of small, almost invisible things continued clicking into place. Texts, a whispered plan, a camera angle saved to a producer's folder titled Narrative. Nina hummed a line to herself that Rosa had taught her, a half-memory like a compass. She didn't know yet how it would be used, only that it would be. The room had seen her ask for food. What it didn't yet see was the ledger of debts and favors that sat behind the polished smiles. And somewhere off stage, someone who had watched her carefully smiled in a way that promised tomorrow would be different. The clip went live before the auditorium had cooled. In 5 hours it had been clipped, captioned and repackaged a dozen ways. Heartbreaking, must-watch, black girl sings for food, charity moment gone viral. The producer's assistant, who had been told to preserve content, sent a curated cut to the event's PR list, highlighting Nina's ask as the emotive pivot of the night. Engagement metrics spiked, fundraising ticked up, coffee was ordered, smiles widened in conference rooms where spreadsheets were called strategy. Carter Lyle watched the numbers like a gambler watching a wheel. He had a talent for turning human edges into neat columns. Impressions earned media sentiment. To him, emotions were widgets. When the sponsor emails began to congratulate the event team, he added a new line to his budget forecast. Audience goodwill. Priceless. He preened over the footage in his office, already envisioning the next gala where they would showcase how they uplifted communities. The pronoun was always the giveaway. Marjorie Ellison received the clip with the calm of someone used to having generosity framed as evidence of virtue. She chaired the foundation that bankrolled the show. Her name floated on press releases like a watermark. She liked the optics, a polished patron image paired with a human tearjerker. In her mind, the story was a neat narrative arc. Sponsor meets need, sponsor fixes, sponsor gets photographed. Anything that complicated that story was inconvenient. The first strain of friction showed up as a comment thread. A local politics blogger, sharp, resentful of cozy philanthropy, questioned whether the moment had been arranged. "Is that how charity works now?" she wrote. The influencer with perfect teeth posted a clip with a laughing emoji and called it a raw moment. In 10 minutes, a hashtag emerged that had no loyalty to facts. "Mucka, sing for a sandwich." Nina noticed the spin as if by instinct. She saw the way camera cuts favored panning to Marjorie's jeweled hand at the table, the way close-ups lingered on Carter's smile when the audience gasped. She kept to the edges, watching how the optics were being built without her consent. That was the first wrench. People were already rewriting what had happened in ways that made her smaller or more useful, depending on the need. Then came the first betrayal. The volunteer who had handed Nina the sandwich, Grace, an earnest grad student with a warmth that almost made her naive, sent Nina a DM. "You're trending. A few producers want to put you on the morning show. People are moved." It read like good news, but there was a subtext Grace didn't see. The offers were prying, conditional, performative. A morning show appearance would mean a short, sanitized story with armchair sympathy and a donation link. It would also mean more cameras, more edits, more narrative control ceded to strangers. At the event's after-party, Carter leaned close enough that his breath carried a faint cigar smell and said, "You did well. We could do something. Bigger. Bookings, funds. You just need to sign some basic releases." He flashed a clipboard with documents printed in small fonts. Nina, who had avoided a lot of snares in life by reading the fine print of people, asked, "What's the catch?" Carter laughed, that full, practiced laugh. "No catches, just exposure." Marjorie, on the other hand, never approached Nina directly. She delegated affection the way powerful people delegate tasks. She issued a statement through the Foundation's communications director praising the courage and resilience exhibited on stage and indicating that the Foundation would explore ways to assist local artists. The press release used possessive language, "our city," "our initiative," that made Nina feel like a display in a glass case. People applauded the statement on social media. No one asked Nina whether she wanted to be helped by a foundation that spoke for her. The antagonist's core was not a single villainous act, it was a pattern. Carter's approach was transactional and precise, how to convert pity into PR. Marjorie's was structural, who benefits when charity is choreographed. Both built systems that swallowed agency, and both underestimated a quiet fact about Nina. She had not come this far by being naive about how narratives are forged. As the days passed, the attention curdled. An op-ed suggested the scene was a performative sleight of hand staged to provoke donors. A local radio host speculated that street performers were gaming audiences. Comments hardened from moved to manipulative. Someone dug into Nina's past and posted a blurred photo of a young woman in a shelter. Then, to zoom in on personal detail, they speculated about paternal absence, about the cycle. The tone shifted from charitable to suspicious, as if curiosity had a stomach acid that dissolved compassion. It got worse when a small item went missing from the sponsor table, a pair of cufflinks that belonged to Marjorie's son. They were not high-value jewelry, but they were an emblem in Marjorie's mind, a symbol of family legacy, a thing she could register as stolen to justify outrage. Security footage, of course, they'll say. A volunteer's statement, done. The narrative that someone from outside took advantage fit comfortably into the pre-existing template. People who saw Nina on stage days earlier now saw an opportunity to complete a story with her as antagonist. Grace, the volunteer, texted Nina, "They're asking everyone questions. Are you okay? They said a guest's cufflinks are missing." Grace's emoji read, worried. Nina felt the old code wind down her spine, the expectation that people from her background would always be suspect. She said nothing at first, then replied, "I didn't take anything. Tell them I sang and left." But the magnetism of suspicion had already done its work. A producer, with a tone that suggested collaboration rather than accusation, asked Nina to come by the studio for clarifying comments. It was soft. Coercion dressed as courtesy. When she declined, saying she was not comfortable, the producer circulated that she had refused to cooperate. The phrasing shifted intimacy away from choice and toward guilt. Marjorie called a meeting with Carter and the communications head. "We need to show control," she said, nails precise in their rhythm on the mahogany table. "If word gets out that the event produces chaos, donors might reconsider. And Carter, we can't have people thinking the foundation is being exploited." Carter, who saw narratives as levers, nodded. "We handle the optics. We'll position it as a regrettable incident, a lesson in event security." Meanwhile, Nina watched the spectacle from the periphery of her life. She felt the pressure the way a pot feels heat, slow at first, then relentless. She was blocked from mainstream opportunities by producers who wanted sanitized versions of her story. Meanwhile, people with influence were using her face to tell a story that made them look generous and her look desperate. It was a double erasure. They would make a hero of someone or a villain of her, but her voice, her agency, would be left on the cutting room floor. Yet quietly there were notes of resistance. A man who worked the soundboard, named Elijah, saved the unedited audio from her performance. He had a sister who'd been passed over by the same system. He knew how important raw records could be. An older woman from the audience, an immigrant with a voice like gravel and a conscience like iron, tweeted the uncut version and wrote, "Listen to the bridge. There's truth there." The tweet did not explode, but it circulated in the neighborhoods that mattered to Nina, the places where people share things because they remember each other's names. This was the crucial miscalculation by Carter and Marjorie. They treated public sentiment as monolithic. They assumed that by narrating what had happened, they controlled all downstream readings. They didn't account for small resistances, unedited clips, an observant volunteer, a soundboard tech who understood what uncut really meant. That miscalculation would be the hinge of the conflict. In boardrooms, people planned press statements. In inboxes, lawyers drafted disclaimers. In hashtags, anger and ridicule fermented. Nina found herself boxed by narratives she had not consented to, vilified subtly when accusations served the convenient arc of good charity misused. But the thing about being underestimated is that underestimation breeds openings. While the big players polish statements, tiny acts, an unshared file, a saved DM, a whispered correction, began to assemble into something like a counter-narrative. As pressure mounted, Nina's choices narrowed and sharpened. She could accept the small offers that demanded her surrender, become an image on a banner, a humanized statistic used for fundraising, or she could risk pushing back. But risking meant stepping into a battlefield where language, power, and money had more armor than she did. She had lived too many nights to romanticize risk. Still, there was a thought in her that kept returning. Music had been her currency since childhood, but maybe, if handled differently, it could be her language of refusal. When a headline later that night read, "Performer at charity event under scrutiny after missing item," it fused two narratives into one, spectacle and suspicion. People retweeted with moral opinions. Donations moved in either direction. Nina read it and felt the suffocating ease by which the world recategorized people, based on taste or discomfort. But in a dim cafe, Elijah cued the full recording for a small group. Listen, no applause at the end, no staged tear, just the bridge. They listened. The raw audio didn't fit Carter's packaged empathy or Marjorie's calendar-friendly charity. It simply existed as truth. That listening planted a seed that the polished rooms could not sterilize. Nina, keeping her guitar case close, began to map possibilities she hadn't had the bandwidth to consider when hunger was louder than plans. She scribbled in the edge of a napkin a single line: "Who benefits?" It was not a dramatic manifesto, just a method to organize thought. Still, it felt like a beginning. Outside, someone had already fed the tabloids a version with Nina at the center of theft accusations. Inside, others kept the uncut truth. Two versions of the same night now circulated. The question was, which would win hearts and headlines? And who would get to decide what winning even meant? There were too many moving parts to declare victory or defeat. The pressure climbed, the antagonists sharpened, and the edges of the story frayed into multiple possible endings. Nina folded her napkin, breathed in words that tasted like rehearsal, and walked toward a door whose hinges she intended to test. The loop tightened. Those who saw only a viral clip thought they knew Nina. Those who kept the uncut sound knew different things. And somewhere between curated compassion and raw truth, a plan would be made. The courthouse of public opinion had two doors, one with velvet ropes and smiling photographers, the other with a narrow back alley where truth often lingered. Nina started using both. The smear campaign tightened like a noose. An anonymous email to a local paper hinted she'd been coached. A blogger rephrased a producer's offhand line as fact, and a morning radio host played an edited clip of the event that cut the bridge from the song into nothing. Listeners gossiped, then judged. The theft accusation hovered over her like a storm cloud that wouldn't move on. Security at the next community center performance followed her more closely than they followed the sponsors. People who'd cheered earlier now crossed streets to avoid her gaze. That pressure should have made her panic. Instead, Nina did what she'd always done when options were few. She planned, not because she fancied herself some mastermind, but because improvisation without record leaves you at the mercy of better narrators. Elijah, the soundboard guy, became more than a quiet ally. He arrived at a late-night rehearsal with a thumb drive like a minor prophet. I kept the raw feed, the one without the applause looped, the one before the host leaned in. They can't edit that away cleanly. He shrugged as if the evidence were just another difficult cable. To Elijah, who'd seen polished events eat the messy truth, the uncut recording felt like oxygen. Grace, the volunteer who'd felt guilty for handing over a plate in the first place, found ways to help that didn't involve PR forms. She typed up a timeline of volunteers' movements that night, who stood where, who left early, who went into the green room, and sent it encrypted. She also confessed, in a voice that trembled with embarrassment, that she'd overheard Marjorie's assistant tell security to shadow the usual suspects. It was small, but precise, a string of tiny facts that, when connected, make a picture you can't ignore. Rosa, the woman who taught Nina ways to sing truthfully, showed up with a thermos and a blunt assessment. "You got attention," she said, "but attention is not always power. Power needs paper, and people who keep receipts." Rosa handed Nina an old notebook of neighborhood contacts, people who'd been overlooked by the Foundation's glossy reports. "They will speak if you ask them the right way," Rosa added. Nina's first tactical move was simple: make the unedited audio public in a context that prevented real-time spin. Elijah uploaded the audio to a niche community site known for archiving raw civic moments. They paired it with Grace's volunteer timeline and a short note from Rosa pointing to the bridge of the song. The post was modestly written. No theatrics, no victim script, just evidence, names, and timestamps. Predictably, the elite reaction was to ignore the upload. Predictably, it did not remain ignored. Neighborhood forums and independent podcasts began to circulate the file. A community radio host, who owed Rosa a favor, aired the full clip with commentary. The sound of Nina's voice, uncut and unframed, traveled in places the polished channels didn't reach. People shared the audio to their groups, then to neighbors, then to a small investigative blogger who had been sniffing for a story about philanthropy as performance. That blogger, June Park, sent a careful message. "I want to look deeper. Do you have any documentation from the night?" Nina sent what she had, a shaky photo of the schedule, a screenshot of the DM from Carter about releases, and a forwarded chain where a coordinator had asked for photographers to capture the emotional arc. June replied with precise questions. The tone felt like partnership rather than pity. Meanwhile, the antagonists tightened tactical screws. Carter and Marjorie's team deployed legal language, polite letters, accusing unauthorized dissemination of event footage, misrepresentation, and defamation. A private investigator, hired quietly, called a few volunteers asking them about Nina's background. A glossy magazine ran an exposé that recycled innuendo. Marjorie, whose image depended on being above, messy details framed the narrative externally as one of regrettable miscommunication, and internally as a managerial problem to be solved. She directed the comms team to close down the noise. That move missed a crucial element. The antagonists were focused on optics, not on the threads that held their story together. They applied pressure where headlines could be trimmed, but they overlooked the substance that could undo the pattern. Documents, voices, and an unslick recording traceable to a soundboard operator who had nothing to gain by lying. Nina had an additional weapon people kept: underestimating. Small legal facts she'd collected while dodging hunger, copies of the event's release forms she'd been pressured to sign, receipts from the volunteer desk, and, more importantly, a photo she'd taken of the production schedule that put Marjorie's son near the sponsor table at the time. The cufflinks went missing. It wasn't a smoking gun on its own, but it was a thread. She printed the schedule, quietly took it to a neighborhood legal clinic, and sat down with a volunteer attorney who did not ask for camera-friendly stories, only for evidence. They talked strategy like people who know small truths can topple big facades. The lawyer, patient and matter-of-fact, spelled out steps: preserve digital copies, get witness statements, and prepare a concise narrative. The legal advice was practical rather than theatrical, civil pushback rather than courtroom drama. At the same time, Nina kept singing. She played low-key gigs where the audience was small but attentive: coffee shops, a church basement, a student lounge. She refused offers that required her to narrate her hardship for clicks. She asked artists to sign simple agreements that allowed her to keep control of recordings. Those micro-venues became rehearsal yards for a different performance, the one where she didn't need to be packaged as inspiration, the one where she could ask questions into microphones rather than hand microphones to others. The antagonists misread her silence as weakness. They believed that exhaustion would prevail, and that she'd accept small deals, invitations to expensive workshops, promises of mentorship from people who couldn't name the local neighborhoods on a map. They were wrong. Exhaustion sharpened her method. An immediate triumph came not as a headline, but as a validation. The cufflink owner, Marjorie's son, mistakenly posted a picture in an unlisted album showing the cufflinks in his blazer pocket. The timestamp on the photo contradicted the timeline the foundation tried to sell. Someone on the events team had sloppily backed up a folder with photos from the night and failed to scrub a file named Sponsor Handouts Final JPG, which contained a hidden metadata tag showing who had placed the items on that table. That flaw didn't take down a foundation on its own, but it gave Nina's lawyer a hinge on which to demand formal preservation of evidence. With those small proofs in hand, Nina made a decision that turned her agitation into direction. She would stop reacting and start setting the pace. She would not attempt to sue for theatrics. She would organize a methodical exposure, collecting witness statements, cataloging unedited footage, and releasing a precise, short sequence that showed the mismatch between the Foundation's statements and what actually occurred. The goal was narrow: not vengeance for spectacle, but accountability. Her allies, Elijah, Grace, Rosa, and June, became a shadow team. They coordinated times to meet, passed on snippets, and practiced how to speak without being co-opted. Elijah digitized old files and tracked down the version history of the event uploads. Grace agreed to contact volunteers who had been too scared to speak earlier. June promised a piece that would not sensationalize but would present the facts. She had readers who valued records over theatrics, but the antagonists were not idle. They doubled down on pressure tactics, legal threats, tightened gatekeeping for media appearances, and discreet calls to donors suggesting the event's image was compromised. Donors are not fans of ambiguity. Many preferred to step back rather than wade into debate. Nina watched as money quietly shifted from community initiatives to safer investments. It stung. This was not just about reputation. It was about how influence redirects resources. On a damp Tuesday, Nina sat on a stoop and rewound her choices. She could try to outshout a PR machine, or she could do something that made shouting unnecessary. She chose the latter. A slow, factual collapse of the narrative they'd built. It was not glamorous. It required patience and records. It also required bravery of a different kind. Persistence with paperwork, with interviews filed in quiet corners, with technical uploads made at odd hours. That night, she recorded a new song in a friend's living room. Not a plea, but a ledger. Lines became questions. Who was benefited by staged charity? Who paid when narratives were sold? It wasn't a courtroom speech, but it wasn't a stereotype either. It was a song that mapped the anatomy of a system. She posted a short excerpt with a caption, "Not a story, just the night." The tone invited curiosity rather than pity. The loop tightened in a way everyone could feel. As Carter and Marjorie tightened their public posture, Nina and her shadow team gathered documents, witness accounts, and raw recordings. The antagonists assumed they were corralling an embarrassing incident. Nina assumed she was corralling evidence. At the end of the week, June's first piece went live, a measured breakdown of the event's timeline, embedding Elijah's raw clip and Grace's volunteer notes, asking precise questions rather than making inflammatory claims. It didn't blow up on mainstream feeds the way a manufactured emotional clip would, but it seeded doubt in places where the foundation's polish couldn't reach. People who had previously chimed in with smart-sounding but hollow comments now had facts to chew on. Nina's decision was clear. She would not be a prop in their campaigns for compassion. She would build documentation, use her voice to ask the hard questions, and give space to witnesses who could corroborate the truth. The next move would require a plan that combined legal pressure, careful release timing, and yes, music used as evidence rather than entertainment. Somewhere in the commotion, someone in Marjorie's team began whispering that they had bigger problems than a viral clip. That whisper was not yet a crack, but Nina and her allies were already laying out the tools that might widen it. The scene had shifted from being about a sandwich and a song to being about who gets to define dignity. And yet, the full strategy was not yet revealed. There were more files to get. One key witness who had stayed silent up to that point, and a moment that would have to be timed to disrupt a carefully scheduled donor gala. Nina tucked those uncertainties into her guitar case and smiled in a way that was not for the camera. She had decided to act. The how would come next. The loop closes on a question. If she could convert raw truth into an irrefutable chain, would the polished halls that depended on optics crumble or simply rebrand? The answer would require planning. A plan that would need doors she hadn't opened yet. They met with the kind of focus that comes from being cornered. The city had its polished rooms and polite smiles. The streets had their own calendars. In a cramped back room above a laundromat, Nina and her circle sketched a plan that relied on slowness, paper, and timing rather than spectacle. Elijah unloaded a small hard drive onto the table and clicked through folders like a man dismantling a clock. "Everything uncut," he said. "Mic levels, backstage chatter, the feed before Carter's bit. There's also a dump from the production laptop, timestamps intact." He tapped a file labeled Sponsor Table 0422 JPG with metadata, showing who was seated where. The room hummed. Evidence, when organized, grew teeth. June Park, the investigative blogger, leaned in with a legal pad. "We don't just release stuff," she said. "We release a narrative that can't be edited into their story. It has to stand by itself." Her voice was precise. She had written bitter pieces about Foundation's spin and knew how to plant an article that reporters couldn't ignore without looking careless. Grace had grown quieter since the scandal began. Now she was a flurry of logistics. She had compiled volunteer schedules, recorded times, and notes about who left the green room when. Her document contained names that no one had thought to call before. "We can corroborate placement and movement," she said. "If we can show Marjorie's assistant asked security to watch the usual suspects, that's motive. If we can show Marjorie's son left the table, that undercuts their story." Rosa arrived last, smelling faintly of strong coffee and folding chairs. She had organized neighbors willing to testify, a bus driver, a caterer, and a barista who'd seen sponsors rehearsing camera shot lines. "They need faces who don't fear cameras," she said. "The publishing can't be just online dumps. People who live next to this work need to say what they saw." Her practical approach grounded the higher tech files with human witnesses. Their strategy formed along 3 axes: documentation, timing, and a controlled public release. Documentation. Preserve everything, notarize where possible. The volunteer attorney had sent a preservation letter to the event company and foundation demanding that no footage or files be deleted. That letter was a legal hinge. If they later claimed files were lost, the preservation request would make the loss. Suspicious. Nina printed hard copies of schedules and receipts. Elijah made redundant backups. June prepared sworn affidavits from willing witnesses. They organized files in a timeline that matched audio to image to personnel movement. The goal was not theatrical proof, but a tight stitch of corroborated facts. Timing. Pick a moment that could not be drowned in PR spin. The Foundation's annual donor gala was 3 weeks away, an opulent night where cameras would be present and Marjorie would bask under flattering lights. The plan: interrupt the narrative at its most polished moment. A live reveal during an event they controlled would either force them to answer in front of donors or prove their ability to silence dissent. The math was simple. Optics matter even to people who try to manufacture them. Controlled release. Use outlets the Foundation couldn't easily dismiss. June lined up a local paper known for accountability reporting and a public radio host who owed a favor to Rosa. They would coordinate timing so the uncut audio, corroborated witness statements, and a short explanatory piece would go live just before the gala's main speech. June would publish. The radio host would air the evidence. The local paper would run a side-by-side timeline. Social media would follow not as the lead, but as amplification, guided by carefully worded posts so the story couldn't be mischaracterized into angry mob. But plans need openings. Their secret move was a quiet one that relied on human unpredictability rather than hacks or theatrics. They would not attempt to embarrass for entertainment. They would force accountability by creating a situation where Marjorie's denial would require facts. Grace had found a small loophole in the guest list. A community award would be presented at the gala to a local youth artist, a segment designed to showcase the Foundation's reach. The award element created a tiny stage. If June published and the radio host played the raw clip during the award segment, donors would get the unvarnished version before Marjorie's speech. People who'd considered writing checks would have to decide whether to applaud the Foundation's generosity or to pause and ask questions. They rehearsed contingencies. If the Foundation threatened legal action, Nina's lawyer would file for immediate discovery and a preservation hearing. If the press room was closed, they would use public radio and push copies to podcasters. If the Foundation tried to buy off witnesses, they would have signed affidavits and time-stamped uploads. Small legal trappings, time-stamped tweets, notarized affidavits, and redundancy in hosting platforms turned rumor into something harder to scrub. Nina's personal role in the plan was deliberate and lean: show up, sing, and resist being framed. She would perform a song that was both art and testimony, lyrics that echoed the unedited bridge but refrained from sensationalism. Her performance would be short, precise, and recorded by multiple independent devices, not to create a spectacle for clicks, but to create a record that matched what had already been archived. She practiced phrasing that keyed listeners to particular lines, phrases that, when heard alongside the evidence, made certain claims nonsensical. They also planted a softer layer of strategy, narrative framing. June insisted they avoid righteous rants and instead center the piece on how philanthropy sometimes eats dignity. That phrasing shifted the frame away from personal melodrama and toward institutional critique, harder for the foundation to reduce to a single disobedient performer. Rosa's contacts would offer short readings at the gala, quiet voices on the margins that would feed local radio with human context rather than just outrage. Then there was the trick no one expected: a decoy. They leaked a minor, harmless audio file, a short interview where Nina discussed her neighborhood music circle to a sympathetic producer. The leak created a smokescreen of human interest pieces that the Foundation's comms team consumed, thinking they'd diffused the narrative by making it relatable. While the comms squad chased feel-good angles, June's team quietly prepped the main upload. The decoy wasn't deceit so much as attention economy manipulation. The Foundation's handlers had limited hours and many messages. Redirect attention, then strike. The subscription queue was small and built into the plan. If this sounds organized, that's because it is, June said, half smiling, as she typed a short line to send to the paper. If you want to follow along live, subscribe to our newsletter. There will be documents attached at the moment the gala goes live. It read like a logistical note, not a plea for followers, but it had the same effect. Subscriptions would ensure the story landed unmediated in readers' inboxes, while the Foundation scrambled to control the hall. Not everyone agreed with the ethics of staging an intervention at a gala. Some feared it would feed the very spectacle they decried. Rosa cautioned them, "We're not making entertainment of people. We're asking a room of donors to choose whether truth matters more than their comfort." The tension shaped decisions. No traps, no humiliation, only documents and questions. The aim was not to destroy, but to force accountability where power had been used to narrate people into smaller roles. The week before the gala, Marjorie's team sent a formal letter accusing unnamed parties of fabricating evidence. They threatened legal action. The lawyer responded with a preservation notice and an affidavit-ready packet. The Foundation's threats came with the expected background hum of donors, murmuring doubt. But some donors also wanted answers. That ambiguity was precisely what Nina's team needed. At night, Nina walked through neighborhoods where people had first heard her sing. She played a soft chord and listened to the city reply. Distant traffic, a neighbor's laugh, the thud of a bus. The plan felt heavy but honest, a methodical unfolding rather than a single vengeful blow. Still, there were unknowns. What if June's piece was suppressed? What if the Foundation had backup PR lines? What if a key witness vanished? They left the room with assignments. Elijah would seed the audio on 3 redundant servers and deliver keys to June. Grace would confirm volunteer affidavits and ensure signatures. Rosa would mobilize community witnesses to attend the gala and be ready to speak to press. The lawyer would file preservation and be on standby for emergency filing. Nina would rehearse the song one last time and avoid any public interviews that might muddy the water. And baked into their plan, like a secret seasoning, was the knowledge that power often collapses under precise, patient pressure. They would not yell louder than the Foundation. They would create a pressure system, legal, technological, human, that made simple denials more expensive than explanation. The strategy was quiet, boring, and therefore dangerous. It required the antagonists to act and produce proof rather than the other way around. On the eve of the gala, tiny rituals kept them human. Rosa made a thermos of coffee. Grace labeled a folder, volunteer affidavits, and double-checked dates. Elijah zipped folders and whispered to the hard drive like a man blessing his tools. June wrote headlines in the dark and threw them away until she liked one that didn't need to be explained. They all understood the stakes. If they timed the release wrong, the story would be flattened into angry backlash. If they timed it right, they forced a conversation in a room designed to avoid it. If you're following this and want to make sure you don't miss how it lands, well, subscribing will get you the exact moment the files go live. Not a sales pitch, just an invitation to witness the next move. The plan was set, the evidence was organized, their allies were in place. What they could not predict was how the polished rooms would react when the uncut sound arrived, and whether the gala's bright stage would hold or fracture under the truth. Would the foundation answer with transparency, or would their show try to swallow the noise once more? The next act would test the value of carefully preserved facts against the velocity of curated narratives. The gala glittered, like a promise. Crystal chandeliers, waiters in tuxedos, donors with names that sounded like investment strategies. Marjorie stood at the podium in that rare calm of someone who believed optics could survive anything, until optics were forced to answer questions they preferred not to hear. 2 minutes before Marjorie's speech, June's piece went live. It wasn't a scream, it was a dossier, a side-by-side timeline, Elijah's uncut audio embedded with exact timestamps, Grace's volunteer affidavits, the sponsor table photo with metadata, and a short clinical note from the neighborhood legal. Clinic demanding preservation of evidence. The headline was simple and surgical. What happened at the altruism gala? A timeline. The public radio host, Rosa's ally, cued Elijah's raw clip to play right as the gala's house band took a polite intermission. On stage, a guitarist strummed, and in living rooms, in donor suites, in phones held by board staffers, Nina's unembellished bridge filled the air. No applause loops, no producer's voice, just her phrasing and the background chatter that matched the volunteer timeline. The sound was a fact delivered without lipstick. In the ballroom, a hush spread like a physical thing. Some donors frowned, others checked their phones. Marjorie's speech cue light blinked. Her prepared remarks, smooth and rehearsed, suddenly felt like a script for a play that no one wanted to watch anymore. Then came the metadata. June's team had quietly made the sponsor table photo available with raw EXIF data. Reporters at the gala pulled it up on their tablets. The timestamp placed Marjorie's son away from the table at the exact minute the cufflinks supposedly vanished. The security footage the foundation had thought private now had a public chain of custody request attached to it because the legal clinic had filed preservation notices. The legal questions moved from hypotheticals to active inquiries. Panic is a shape everyone can recognize, the way smiles stiffen into lines, the way hands that earlier posed for cameras now balled into invisible fists. Marjorie's assistant, the quiet woman who had told security to shadow the usual suspects, was suddenly the subject of whispered phone calls. The Foundation's PR team had 10 different contingency phrases that all assumed denial as the first move. Tonight, denial would have to pass a fact-check first. Carter, who had been an architect of spin, realized too late that the city had pockets and platforms he couldn't control. His phone lit with messages from sponsors asking whether the gala was still aligned with their values. One donor texted, "Is this true? If so, we need to reconsider our pledge." In the space of a few minutes, money, reassuring, predictable money, started to look like a conditional vote. Marjorie took the podium with the color gone from her face in a way that lighting couldn't fix. She opened her mouth and, for the first time in public in a long while, made a mistake. She tried to soothe without facts. "We are investigating," she said, voice thin. "We take these allegations seriously." It was the language of a manager hoping process would bury doubt. But June's piece had already done two things. It had matched audio to volunteers, and it had made calls to people who remembered details donors didn't want to hear. Volunteers who had been terrified now felt something like collective courage. Grace stood up in the mezzanine, irrationally small among chandeliers, and handed a reporter a signed statement. Rosa's neighbors, bus drivers, baristas, caterer, ringed the press area with quiet, steady corroboration. Each voice was a small nail in the Foundation's preferred narrative. Marjorie's reaction changed from controlled to reactive. Her legal counsel stormed the stage like someone trying to hold back a dam with a folder. They demanded retraction, threatened suits for misrepresentation, and suggested the gala was being ambushed. It was a classical move. Claim victimhood and hope the noise drowns the facts. But threatened suits don't change timestamps. The assistant's nervousness became a story of its own when a tech-savvy reporter unearthed a Slack message. "Make sure the usual optics are ready. If anything odd happens, keep shooting." The message was banal, corporate speak, until it wasn't. The wording suggested coordination, not accident. As the evening fissured, donors split into quick factions, those who demanded immediate answers, and those who quietly packed their coats and left before anyone could ask them to account for donations. The Foundation's Instagram still had the gala hashtag, but comments flooded with clipped facts and links to June's timeline. The polished narrative splintered under the weight of accessible records. Nina watched from the edge of the lobby, guitar case at her feet, not because she wanted a show, but because she had chosen to keep her hands clean. When a local reporter approached, she did not deliver a soliloquy. She handed over Elijah's thumb drive, 2 printed affidavits, and the copy of the preservation letter. "I sang," she said quietly. "I asked for food. I didn't steal anything. I sang again tonight because the record matters." Her restraint was hard to misread. There was no dramatic accusation, only a series of documents with signatures and timestamps. Class and dignity can be a kind of rhetoric. In that room, it cut deeper than a shout. The boardroom fallout was swift. Within 48 hours, an emergency board meeting was convened. Donors demanded transparency. A prominent member said publicly that the Foundation would suspend Marjorie's public-facing roles pending an independent audit. The board, in panic, announced a temporary freeze on event programming until paperwork could be reviewed. Investors and grant committees called. Some withdrew their names from the upcoming season. Reputation, an intangible currency Marjorie traded, began to evaporate. But pain doesn't always fall cleanly. Marjorie was not ruined in one stroke, far from it. She hired a PR firm that spun regrettable errors and offered statements about improving internal oversight. She also reached out quietly to some witnesses, offering compensation, framed as settlements. Money can disinfect stories, and some frightened volunteers considered pocketing relief to avoid crossfire. That move, predictable, corrosive, was a new test for Nina's coalition. A few people took the money, others didn't. Grace refused. Elijah refused. The barista from Rosa's block refused and spoke to a TV crew instead. The division revealed a quiet moral geography. Some people, having little, would trade silence for immediate relief. Others would risk the trouble because truth had a different kind of value in their lives. Nina felt the sting of watching someone take hush money, but she did not let it shape her actions. Her aim had never been personal destruction. It was disruption of a mechanism that permitted theft of dignity. Legal pressure mounted. The Foundation filed a temporary restraining claim trying to block distribution of unauthorized footage. Thin attempt to control the narrative by legal muscle. But the preservation notice and the redundant uploads Elijah had made created a logistical thicket. Discovery processes pulled internal emails into public view. One email, sent from a production manager to Carter, read, "We should design moments. The tug used the streets people for optics." The phrasing was clumsy, but it echoed the pattern: people as props. What no one in power saw coming was how ordinary people turned the evidence into questions donors felt they couldn't ignore. A wealthy board member, who had been poised to donate a sizable sum that night, called the press to ask for more details, then publicly announced a pause on funding until an independent audit was completed. That pause rippled into other pledges. Institutions, sensitive to public perception, paused too. It wasn't theatrical collapse. It was the way accountability works when small facts find sympathetic leverage. Marjorie felt the ground shift under her polished shoes. Her public humiliation was not a viral meme, but a steady loss of influence. Event cancellations, removed headshots from websites, and the murmur of "recused" beside her name on certain announcements. She tried to pivot, but the pivot required a willingness to clarify actions she had chosen not to record. Nina did not dance on the ruins. She declined offers of payment framed as recompense for trauma. She accepted no charity that asked her to be a poster child for someone else's virtue. Instead, she insisted on a simple demand: an independent audit and community oversight for future programming. She used the moment to lift the conversation from personal vindication to institutional reform. How many other moments had been engineered? How many other faces had been used to raise funds while the underlying problems remained unaddressed? That move reframed the conversation. It became less about a girl who asked for a plate of food and more about the structures that turn human suffering into campaign material. Marjorie was forced into a defensive posture where she had to pledge reforms she had never previously considered. The board's interim measures read like a catalogue of humility: independent auditors, a code of ethics, volunteer representation in event planning. Whether those promises would become law or PR copy was still unclear, but the mechanism of accountability had been engaged. In private rooms, the antagonists raged. Carter blamed production. Marjorie blamed a coordinating misinterpretation. They called Nina a troublemaker in the insecure hours where people try to shrink things back into order. Yet their fury could not hide a basic fact. Evidence is difficult to negotiate with when it wears signatures and timestamps. The climax closed not with a single judicial hammer, but with a cascade of small checks, cancelled donations, paused events, a board inquiry, and a foundation's public apology drafted with legal care. An apology that sounded like a practice run for contrition. Marjorie watched as the ledger of reputation thinned. She had lost more than public favour. She had lost the comfortable narrative that allowed her to be seen as a benefactor rather than a manager of perception. Nina stood in the aftermath with the same quiet she had used throughout. She had not sought spectacle. She had sought a record. She had wanted truth presented in such a way that it would be costly to obscure. The victory felt less like vengeance and more like an upright accounting, small, precise, and hard to deny. She had used music as proof and strategy as scaffolding, not to humiliate, but to insist that dignity not be sold for a charitable photo op. Still, the story had more folds. Some donors would return once the audit promised tidy fixes. Some staff would quietly be reassigned and never named. Some quiet corners of power would remain intact, simply nudged. And there were questions Nina couldn't answer yet. Would the reforms be permanent or performative? Would the people who had been used before be truly included in decision-making or simply tokenized? The loop tightened. Accountability had begun. But the system that enabled the spectacle was resilient. The final move, what would become permanent change, was not yet written. There was one more act required, a transformation that turned an exposure into durable reform. That would demand not only evidence, but institution-changing will, community involvement, and a persistence that did not tire when headlines cooled. As cameras receded and the gala's cleaned-up press photos circulated, someone in the shadows prepared a new set of documents, emails that suggested wider coordination, donors who had pushed for certain impact narratives. Nina felt the pull of another round. She felt the quiet hunger for systemic answers rather than single-night triumphs. Would exposure lead to meaningful reform, or would it simply create a new script with different actors? The answer would be found in the slow, uncomfortable work of follow-through, audits, board, restructuring, changed contracting practices. Nina's next steps were already forming in her head, not just to show what happened, but to make sure it couldn't happen the same way again. And so the tension remained. The nail had been set in the foundation's veneer, but the house had many rooms. The last move was not yet made, and the clock for it was ticking. The aftermath was neither cinematic nor tidy. It arrived in small, official letters, in a board meeting transcript that leaked, in an independent audit that recommended new oversight and community seats at the planning table. It unfolded. In meetings where people who'd been practiced at smiling now read clauses out loud and learned the word accountability in contexts where it had been a cosmetic. For Nina, the victory was procedural rather than vengeful. Policies rewritten, volunteers given a voice, and a small fund redirected to neighborhood-led programming with transparent governance. Months later, the Foundation's website showed fewer glossy portraits and more plain text, minutes of meetings, conflict of interest policies, a section where volunteers could submit concerns directly. Some donors returned after insisting on seeing the audit's follow-up actions. Others did not. Marjorie's public role was reduced to an advisory post with no event authority, and Carter moved to a consultancy position that forced him to write reports rather than stage moments. Those outcomes satisfied some people and left others, especially those who had been offered hush money, with unresolved feelings. Systems change is never absolute. It rearranges power rather than erasing it. For Nina, life changed in ways that had nothing to do with headlines. She was invited to sit on the new Community Advisory Board, not as a symbol, but with an actual vote. The gig she accepted now paid. The offers that required her to narrate poverty for applause were politely declined. With funds raised by a small coalition of neighborhood donors and sympathetic artists, she created a free monthly music workshop for kids, one that refused to frame hardship as content and instead taught skills, songcraft and rights, how to document, how to demand receipts, how to protect a performance from being turned into someone else's fundraising prop. Her reputation shifted from a viral image to a living practice. People in the neighborhood watched the workshop and recognized that dignity looked like a classroom full of young people learning harmony rather than a staged tear for a camera. Rosa's influence grew locally. Elijah took a job at a community radio station preserving civic audio archives. Grace went on to study nonprofit management and vowed to build programs without optics-first mindsets. These were small victories, but they had teeth. They redirected resources, created jobs, and taught a new generation to treat public narratives as things to be cared for rather than exploited. Marjorie, privately, faced more complicated losses. She had to answer to a board that had once deferred to her instincts. She wrote the apology every public relations person rehearses, measured, regretful, and legally reviewed. But outside of sanitized statements, the ledger of influence had thinned. Invitations that once flowed her way were now routed differently. Power had not been annihilated, only checked. That nuance mattered to Nina. She had insisted on change that tamed systems rather than personally punishing a single figure, because institutions, not individuals, had been the architecture enabling the spectacle. There were legal settlements too, some quiet, some public. A few volunteers accepted compensation and signed non-disclosure agreements. Others refused and testified. Nina never celebrated those who took money. She understood hunger sometimes demands choices that look pragmatic rather than principled. She used the moment to push for structural answers, emergency relief funds with transparent oversight instead of one-off gestures that allowed organizations to buy goodwill. The harder, longer work began when the cameras were gone. Audits require implementation. Policies require enforcement. Community seats can be token unless given real power. Nina stayed involved, not because she wanted credit, but because she had seen how easily narratives can snap back into place. She attended meetings, asked inconvenient questions, and insisted that the new oversight body include legally binding commitments, not performative paragraphs. Change, she learned, is a muscle that needs consistent exercise. On an unremarkable Tuesday, she walked past the old auditorium and noticed a flyer announcing a youth performance series vetted by the new board. Her name appeared as a mentor. She smiled without grand gestures. In the basement rehearsal room, a young girl tuned a second-hand guitar and asked Nina whether people would always look at her like a story. Nina sat, tuned a string, and answered with the blunt tenderness Rosa had given her years before. People will look however they do. Our job is to prepare you so that when they look, you can decide how to answer. Truth, in the end, was not a viral clip. It was the slow accumulation of records, witnesses, and people who refused to be reduced. The Foundation's public face had been forced to alter its script, but broader systems still needed watching. Nina knew that reform could be reversed by changing board members or by donor fatigue, so she taught others to archive, to counsel, and to demand receipts. Her music remained central, but no longer as a charity prop. It became a tool, an audible ledger that could be time-stamped, verified, and used as evidence when necessary. The moral felt simple and sharp. Dignity can't be manufactured by cameras or repackaged as feel-good content. It must be built into procedures, respected in transactions, and defended by people trained to notice the small edits that change meaning. Nina's real revenge, if one could call it that, wasn't humiliation or spectacle. It was the quiet work of constructing alternatives so that the next person singing for a plate would be seen as an artist and a rights holder, not a thumbnail. They had tried to reduce her to a moment. She turned that moment into a movement toward accountability and community power. They tried to control the narrative. She rebuilt the channels through which truth travels. In plain terms, they tried to destroy Nina's credibility by making her a prop, but in trying to shield their image, they exposed their methods. And those methods did more damage to them than any rumor could. If you want to follow the next steps, how the new oversight holds up under pressure, how neighborhood-led funding changes programming, and whether institutional promises turn into practice, subscribe to stay updated. These outcomes require persistence, not applause. They tried to make Nina vanish, but in the attempt they revealed themselves. Nina learned that true revenge is not returning harm. It's achieving a life and influence they could never imagine themselves creating.